So please join me in welcoming Dave Bailey on stage.
Thank you so much. Let's see if my mic's working. Oh, it is. Marika, thank you so much for that. Let me grab my clicker. Welcome to Startup Grind. Today, I get the pleasure of talking to you about describing your business. And as we all know, it's really difficult to do well. It can be difficult to get your big product idea into a single sentence, but it can also be difficult to understand when you're talking about it. So I'm going to hopefully shed some light on that with you today. A little bit about me. I think Marika said most of it already. So I'm a founder coach, and I work with CEOs that are growing their businesses, typically at the Series A and Series B stage. And a lot of them are in the same position as you guys. They're building out their teams, they're building out their companies, they're trying to figure out how to manage themselves, and I lend some steer there as well. I was also in VC for a couple of years, and I have a blog called The Founder Coach as well. So today, as I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about why one-sentence product descriptions even matter. You guys have a lot of priorities. You're perhaps fundraising, recruiting. So why dedicate time to figuring out a one-sentence product description? I'm going to shed some light on that. I'll talk through the qualities of a great one-sentence description, and then I'm going to give you a formula that will hopefully give you a new way to think about your product, not only to describe it more simply, but maybe even to build a more simpler product as well. But first, why one-sentence product descriptions? Among all your priorities, why dedicate at least some time to this? Well, like you, I've been in your shoes, building out my masterpiece, my startup. For now, the Mona Lisa is the startup. And it's a really complicated engineering challenge to get all of that information into a sentence or into a small pitch. But on the other hand, you guys know more about your product than anyone else. So I remember when someone asked me to describe my first startup in a short passage, I thought, no sweat, I got this. I know all of the information, it's going to be super easy. So I tried to whittle it down to a 60-second pitch, and I would give my pitch to people, and I would get confused looks. Now, has anyone ever described their product only to get these confused looks? I can see some smiles out there. Yes. Show of hands. How many of you? OK, everybody. Yes. It's really difficult. So my strategy was to practice, and I would iterate, and I would try and make it better and better and better, with the idea being, like, if I could just get it right, it'll be enough. And largely it was, especially in investors. You get 60 seconds, but then you get some follow-up. Then I became an investor myself. And I had the challenge of taking this kind of very compressed description of a company and kind of uncompressing it in my head. And as you know, if you take a thumbnail and you compress it and then you kind of blow it back up, things get really blurry. So my initial strategy, was I would squint my eyes. And I thought if I could just blur out the other person, the blurry description and the blurry image would cancel out and I'd get clarity. So I'd be like, OK, I'm going to try and get it. It didn't work. So my strategy as an investor was to ask questions. And I would give 30 minutes of Q&A so I could really understand what it was that the founder was building. I wanted to get as excited about it as they were. But here's the thing. You can't elevator pitch the world. And most of the people that learn about your products, it's not going to be in a pitch setting. You're not going to get a 60-second elevator pitch. You're not going to get 30 minutes of Q&A. It's going to happen in natural conversation, in the businesses you're selling to. If you're selling to consumers, you're going to want word of mouth. And 60 seconds is too long. So what does word of mouth look like? Well, here's an average word of mouth scenario. Starts off with some sort of trigger in a natural conversation. Maybe the need that your product addresses comes up in conversation, and one person says to the other, hey, have you heard about product X? And then the other person kind of gives an invitation and says, no, what's it do? And then something happens. The person describing the product is under an immense amount of pressure to describe the product as quickly as possible. And they get about 1 or 2 seconds max to get the message across. And if they get it across, then the conversation blooms, and your product becomes the topic of conversation. If the description flops, then it's game over. And critically, the person sharing your product has not spent hours and hours practicing and iterating their pitch. They just make it up on the spot. And there's no assumption of 30 minutes of Q&A afterwards. So it's a really high-pressure situation. And moreover, it's not actually a pitch. There's people who talk about your products within companies, they don't want to seem like a salesperson. They just want to describe as quickly as possible what your product does. And so basically, it follows then that the easier to describe that your product is, the more likely you are able to sell it, and other people can sell it for you. And as I said, this is not just a B2C thing. If you're looking at this saying, well, word of mouth, that might apply to consumer products, but for businesses it's different. Well, not really, because as soon as you have that pitch with someone in a business, they're going off and they're trying to evangelize your product to other people. So they need a really simple way to describe it too. So if you can figure out an easy way to describe your business, you're going to help your customers and help your stakeholders talk about your business for you. With that said, what are the qualities of a great description? Like most communication, it boils down to being engaging. You want people to pay attention to what you're saying. It's about being concise. Again, if there's something that you could leave out, you should leave it out. And lastly, it has to be specific. So no one won a competition for being vague. The more specific you can be, the better. Now, yesterday, a colleague of mine, this is genuinely a true story, an ex-colleague of mine was starting a business and he wanted an introduction. And I know him really well. I said, of course, I'd be glad to introduce you. And so he sent me a description of his product. And the description of his product was, it's the Amazon for the afterlife. Does anyone know what this product does? That's not bad. I didn't know, and I haven't actually checked. I didn't know. I think it has something to do with ghosts. I'm not sure. But I really didn't understand. So there's a common framework out there that's kind of like position yourself as, you basically compare yourself to a really big company that most people know. The problem with this is you're making a lot of assumptions, and often, very often, the assumptions don't fall through. So you're assuming that the person knows the company. In the case of Uber, I think we've all heard of Uber, but you'd be surprised how many Uber Frexes I've heard, but compared to some startup I've just never heard of. But more problematically, it's not really clear what part of the company you're comparing yourself to. So with Uber, they have this service that's almost instantaneous. You press the button, and within 5 minutes, something happens. Are you comparing yourself to that kind of speed? Is it the business model? Is it the fact it's a marketplace? Who knows? And of course, what if you're actually setting an expectation that you do everything that Uber can do? You do the speed, you do the ratings, you do everything. If you set up that expectation that you can do what a company with thousands of developers can do, it's very likely going to lead to disappointment. But there is a better way. So what I tried to do when I was researching one-sentence descriptions was to try and figure out how the founders of high-growth startups did it in the early days. Was there something about the way that they were talking about the products that made them easier to share? And here's what I found. What I'm going to show you is a clip of Mark Zuckerberg a long time ago. Everyone know who Mark Zuckerberg is? We all know. Listen to the way he describes his product.
It was to make something where you could type in someone's name and find out a bunch of information about that.
There you go. It's something you can type in someone's name and find out a bunch of information about them. Now, he doesn't use any jargon. He doesn't talk about social networks. He doesn't talk about platforms. He doesn't talk about a way to connect the world. He just says in really simple language, you type in something and you see information. This is Travis Kalanick from Uber.
Push a button, and in 5 minutes, a Mercedes S-Class or a town car comes and picks you up and takes you where you want to go.
You push a button, and in 5 minutes, you get a really cool car to pick you up and take you where you want to go. They simplified it further to push a button, get a ride. It's, again, really simple. He's not talking about on-demand economy. He's not talking about marketplaces. He's not talking about transportation. He talks about the simplest of languages. And there's a pattern. So I want to talk about the pattern here. I call it the input-output model. And it's quite a helpful pattern. On the one side, it says, you do X. And X is a non-zero, but a small input from the user. And Y happens. And this is the output. And what's quite interesting about both of these cases is they elevate a single feature of the product, and they use that to lead their entire product description. Both these products have hundreds of features, but they pick out one, and they have some interesting properties. So firstly, these are the unique features. Why do they lead with a unique feature? If they didn't, they're just keying themselves up for the question, why are you different from X? And we know when we get that question, it's a horrible question to receive because it's a why question, so it puts us on the defensive. But it's also obviously desirable. It's really important that it's obviously desirable, because if it's not obviously desirable, you're keying the question, why are you building this? So it really does need to be, you need to spell it out. It needs to be really obviously desirable. But you do X, and Y happens. So this has some really interesting properties in a single sentence. It's a mini story. You're taking the listener on a journey. It's very concise. You're leveraging a model of software. Software has inputs and outputs, and we don't really mind how it works. We just care about what I have to do and what I can get from it. 2, it's really engaging, because as soon as you put you into a sentence, you activate this simulator in the brain. And you're taking them on this journey, and they're kind of simulating their brain. Oh, I do this, and that happens. That's pretty cool. And then thirdly, it's specific. And the great thing about just focusing on one feature is you can put in extra language to make it sound really, really, really cool. Just like the way Travis talked about the Mercedes. I think that adds like a little bit of extra desirability. There's another really cool property of this particular way of talking about products, is you can get the wow factor. And what is the wow factor? It's actually that if you have a big output and a very small input, then you can get people to go, ooh, that's really cool. And again, I think that's what we want to strive for when it comes to describing products. Another place that I saw this was in a book called The Elements of User Onboarding by Samuel Kulik. So I'd like to call him out, because it's a very, very cool way to think about it. But one way to think about it is this. I don't know if you guys used to play Super Mario when you were kids, or maybe last week. The plant power-up, right? Now, you could spend time talking about the plant. You could say that it's green and that there's, yellow petals. But the best way to say it is you walk over the power-up, and then you can shoot fireballs. And that's, I think, how you want to talk about your product. You want to figure out what your fireballs are and talk about those. So you go over the plant, and you throw fireballs. That's pretty cool. I like that. Now, how can you create your one-sentence description? So I'm going to go through a little bit of a process that you can use to apply this to your companies. First of all, you need to choose a lead feature. You want to start off with your user journey in chronological order. So you take your journey, and this is the journey on the other side. There's inputs and outputs. This is the chronological sequence as the user goes through it. And then you want to identify a unique, obviously desirable feature or output of this product. And once you've found that one that you want to lead with, then you can just figure out the minimum input and put the two together, and hey presto, you've got a one-sentence product description. OK, I'm going to preempt some questions. What if you can't decide which is best? So you're building products that are in the software space. They're going to be complicated, and they're going to be very complex systems of features that all work together. So how do you choose them? Well, there's a few things you can do. Firstly, you can create a bunch of different one-sentence descriptions, and you can test them. Maybe put them on your favorite ad platform and see which your customers engage with most. You could, if you already have a product out in the market, you can look at your usage data and see which of the unique features people are engaging with most as they use your products. And then lastly, every time you meet someone new is a new opportunity to try and figure out what sticks. So you might need, unlike natural conversation, you might need to add a little bit more context before you jump into it. You might say, I'm building company X. I'm focusing on these customers when this happens to them. I'm talking about the trigger of the need. And then you can jump straight into your one-sentence description and look for the faces. Do you get a wow? Do you get a ooh? Or do you get the kind of scrunched up blurring of the eyes? That's a good test. I've done some examples using B2B and AI startups. I'll just read them through, see which ones you like. Drift. You add the Drift chatbot to your website, and it uses AI to ask questions to visitors and pass qualified leads immediately to a sales rep. It can be quite long, but it has to be clear. Slack. You invite your team to chat groups called channels, and then all communication is now open and searchable, unlike email. And Pymetrics, that's an AI startup. You get your team and job candidates to play an online game, and then it uses AI to determine which candidates are likely to perform well at your company. Again, I'm not using the words platform, transformation. It's very simple stuff that a child can understand. What about all these non-lead features? What about all the features that maybe they don't make the cut and you don't want to communicate them? Well, it might be that some of these features are unnecessary. Some of them they're like the supporting cast to the lead, but some of them may well be unnecessary. Now, I learned about the next feature fallacy the hard way by spending 10 years building a whole bunch of features that made no impact in my product. So I know the excitement that you can get when you have this idea for a feature and you want to get it out there. You get out into the world, you look at the metrics, and nothing's happened. And so be very cautious of any features that are not unique and they're not obviously desirable and they're not candidates for lead features. It might well be that you're building something that isn't obviously desirable and people actually don't want. That happens quite a lot, even in big companies. So if you're still struggling, the implication is you shouldn't really rely on word of mouth. If it's hard for you to describe your product in a single sentence, you shouldn't rely on a whole bunch of other people doing it for you. Often, listening to the way customers talk about your product is a great way to find these one-sentence descriptions. But again, if you're building something very complex, don't expect word of mouth, and hire a sales team. If these are complex sales, you're going to have long sales cycles, so brace yourself. Simple usually wins. OK, so key takeaways. It's better to be compelling than comprehensive. So the mission in this one-sentence description is not to fit everything and compress everything down. It's just to pick one or two things that you know people find really desirable and really interesting that can open up a conversation for you guys. Secondly, in doing so, you might find features that you don't need. So take every opportunity you can to simplify your product. The simplest products are often the easiest to sell. And thirdly, creativity comes from constraints. And I've used this model with a lot of people, and often just forcing your product into this kind of quite restricted framework often leads to really interesting insights about not only how to position your product, but what products you can build. And I'll leave it there. Thanks very much for listening. Q&A? So I'm happy to take any questions. Yes? Do you want to stand up and give us your name and company?
Sure.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Nikhil. I'm the founder of Sonic Jokes. I'm refining the one product.
OK, yeah.
I'm not going to say that yet. So a lot of the descriptions that you described, for example, Pi metrics, etc., has the words like chatbot, AI. Obviously, the examples below are much cleaner in terms of no kind of tech jargon.
Yes.
A lot of the people we speak to are non-technical people, particularly with sales cycles. How do you deal with kind of not using the word chatbot when you have a chatbot, or not using the word AI and kind of, I don't know, simplifying it even further, basically?
How do you just don't use those words?
Okay.
It would be my answer. So the thing about you don't have to have one-sentence product description for everyone. And the beauty is you can have kind of as many as you need. Often in conversation, the feature that's most relevant to the conversation will be how the product is described kind of in the wild. So you want to gauge your audience, engage their level, and just I think the model works really well, inputs and outputs, but just try to make it as simple as you can. And if you think someone doesn't get AI, leave it out. One more?
Hi, my name is Hitesh. So you should have a multiple pitch if you are approaching the different markets and different kind of people. So you should have one pitch or multiple pitch depending on whom you are talking.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. So for example, if you take a marketplace, you actually have two sets of customers. You have the supply and the demand. So you might be able to create one-sentence descriptions for both the supply and the demand, and then adapt that to whatever you're talking to. Typically, if you're using this, as the demo part of your pitch, if you can't show them and you want to describe it, I often say start with your largest customer base. So usually the demand side. Figure out what's in it for them, and then get to the supply side later on. There we go. One more. There we go.
My question was, so our company is very specified towards, I'm going to say, marketing and brand professionals.
Yes.
Do you still recommend not using jargon, even though that's their language, I'd say?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, the question was, if you're marketing, or if you're talking to marketing professionals that tend to use a lot of jargon, should you put more jargon in? That's a really interesting question. I think you want to try it out. Because what you want, like the perfect one-sentence description gets an ooh. It's a ooh, that's really cool. And to get that, you want a really small input. So from the marketing professional, they don't have to do too much. They need to connect a few platforms or put in some data, and then some really cool output comes out. I don't think you need to use jargon when you're talking about output, because jargon usually comes in when you're talking about describing, like the plant of the product. Figure out the fireballs and talk about those. That would be my advice. Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you very much.